Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. Hey, wait, you didn't miss a thing. Charles, having bypassed the novelties of the latest Lexus model, stood at the hood and, folding his arms on his chest, smirked at the named bespectacled man. He was about to leave with a bucket of brushes and rags. There were other autos waiting for him, but he came back, stood next to Charles, and looked at the shining clean surfaces of the car. It was a simple budget car wash that the golden boy of the school had stopped by for the sole reason of noticing and recognizing his 11th grade roommate. James Pry whistled, realizing that the rumors were not lying. This nerd really is a black job. That's the kind of poor person he is. And now, standing next to someone Charles couldn't stand, enjoyed every moment of it, because James hadn't humiliated him like that yet. And moreover, now it was possible to show off in front of Diana, his girlfriend from the parallel class, who sat on the passenger seat, the front, living on gum, and with a sneer, looking at the scene playing out in front of her. What a miss. With those words, Charles lifted his foot and soles and swiped while sweat, leaving a muddy trail behind him. 3 is better. And laughed that smartest start to his career. But nothing about the weather will get you a diploma. Look, the cleaner of entrances and basements will give lie down. A head taller, twice as skinny, blonde freckles, and literally on the pitiful kin, collected clothes. James stood, lowering his head and looking at his dirty stain. It wasn't the first time he'd been humiliated, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. And it wasn't just that since the 4th grade the kid had been known as an upstart, who always had his homework ready, who always rushed to the blackboard himself, who is the first in everything from tests to Olympiads. You'd think he'd be the first, but he gave everyone the heat, and if you had to run or climb a rope, maybe all this would have been tolerated at school if James hadn't been a subhuman, and at least communicated humanely, but he didn't. He'd never cheat. He didn't belong to any company, didn't court girls, didn't say much about himself. High school students said that he had some kind of syndrome, like a human genius, like an asshole was born by quitting. It was known that he ate at the school cafeteria on benefits, and he lived in a bedroom community, in a 5-story building on the verge of emergency, in the company of his mother, a drunkard, and his grandfather, an old professor of some university, who in his old age had gone mad and could only talk about his disciplines with others, and constantly forced his grandson to study. In short, the background did not contribute to popularity. Guys from those who keep in fear at the door. Other schoolchildren were quickly recognized in the possession of easy prey. But there was another problem. He was virtually unresponsive, and no matter what they did to him, teased. Poured glue in his briefcase, he was silent, even once beaten. So he just fell down, covering his head and stomach from the blows, curled up, as if some kind of animal in a ball. And they fell behind, because, well, how can you hit someone who purposely does not try to give back even in senior year? We've almost all lost interest. What can you take from a poor guy? All of them, but not Charles. And this excellent student, which either mothballs or wormwood, was like a bone across his throat. What are you looking at? Charles shouted at the blonde and pushed him in the shoulder. Not too hard. James suddenly turned sharply, and his gaze was so prickly, so hard that Charles Ross closed his eyes, and the smile slid off his face. A thought flashed through my brain that it happens. You tease a beast, but it tolerates it, and then it will rush in and snatch something off it. That's a problem. Another car wash worker came up to them, a grown man, and for some reason with a wrench in his hand. No, Charles replied with a smile. It's fine. James, meanwhile, silently picked up a rag and began to clean up the footprint. The final exams were approaching, and there was no time for squabbling. Charles, of course, bragged that he had seen a bespectacled man working at the car wash. That was wrong. When everyone was sitting at the table in the canteen, suddenly a girl, the daughter of the school principal, said, "She has a big, smart girl, a beauty, whom parents promised to send to study in Cambridge. James for grandfather for the medicine works. He's completely out of his mind, survived, and had a second stroke. And that's as far as I'm concerned. Charles shrugged. He's the son of a businessman. He had no doubt he'd do well in life. His mother would be paid, and a prestigious university would take him into business. The young man felt himself a king and did not think how it was possible to exist differently than people of his circle and those who were worse off. He considered the weak to be idiots, who couldn't adapt to reality, which meant they belonged at the bottom of the hierarchical ladder among the servants. And punching bags. Like James, you've heard of the law of the boomerang. The girl bowed her head. You reap what you sow. You reap what you reap. What? I gave him the job. Then and now. Don't be like that. He waved his hands in the air, unable to find the words. Final exams. That was the force that seemed to be the only thing that could possibly break the long-standing enmity and make him forget about his personally invented regular occupation of choosing how to humiliate, insult, hit harder, even if not physically, the one who simply by the mere fact of his existence on Earth pisses him off. Yeah, what's his name? James rolled his eyes at Charles. It was already late in the evening, when his classmates, of course, admitted by rank into his circle, were celebrating the graduation. Yeah, who named him that? Grandfather must have chuckled at Mason, Charles' constant companion in all his adventures. He wanted a piece of his successful, beautiful life somehow. Where do you think he'll go? Asked in a thin voice Sophia Rottenblond father, who owned a high-end grocery store and has no idea. He'll probably become homeless. His house is going up for condemnation. For the likes of them to live in. Some crooks are gonna scam him. We've heard of them finding a new apartment and offering to trade it for a bargain. Double it themselves. The guy angrily kicked a pebble on the road. Everyone was walking along the embankment, admiring how pleasure boats were gliding along the river surface. They were going for a ride on one themselves. And James, indeed, disappeared from everyone's radar after graduation. His house was really dispersed, then demolished, and the structure was leveled to the ground former, once cozy yard for residents. Where earlier in the spring all drowned in lilac bushes and grew on this place shopping center, noisy, expensive. Charles entered the Faculty of Economics in the most prestigious university in the city, and of course, not for a budget place struggled, but for a paid one, thanks to his father. In general, life seemed to the young man a holiday. He received his diploma, and his father, of course, took him into the business. And that was trucking. He bought his son an apartment in an elite new building. And of course, every now and then he threw in some money for pocket money, so to speak, expenses. Charles lived like that until he was 28, and then it was like something in the universe broke. It all started when his father called him and his mother Adriana in the hotel and confessed that he was practically bankrupt because the competitors, seeing the unfair game, were attacking, and he, trying to save the business and somehow earn money, took loans from serious and dangerous people. But it did not work out with the new business, and now we have to sell off the fleet because on interest. Are we beggars? Adriana, who hadn't worked a day since Charles was born and who didn't see herself as anything other than a socialite, clutched at her heart. No, of course not. Remember how we started out, honey. We started out as families, we collectively. We sat in boxes for weeks. But we made it out, yeah. Out of life, by the way. Ended with a hint that in recent years, oh how late, how too late, Jacob realized, from pampering the family himself in this burn, what could have been done. They were used to the good life even too much. The son, though he learned, though he went into business, it took him. He didn't want to work like that. Daddy, give me a bigger salary. But he didn't want to get into the business himself. So it turned out that with all the wealth there was no peace of harmony, and a lot of things were not in the house. One day Jacob looked into the workshop he kept small for the car fleet, saw how one driver was fixing cars at once, and next to his son, a kid was spinning around, giving tools. Jacob thought then, that's lucky. A man is growing up. Someone's heart has been sewn up lately. Jacob the man did not even want to think about how quickly his son and his wife is property. What's left, they'll spend on their own wants. Pro-eat will spend, hoping, apparently, that the Jenny to them, or something, should appear and give everything. Dad, but you do something, don't you? Charles waved his hands. And Dad, give me some money. We're going to a club with some friends. I can't be a pauper, can I? What happened next was sad. Look, but predictable and inevitable. The business was completely gone. But there was still, however, a stash of money set aside, and Jacob believed it would hold up. He would start again, but an acute heart attack intervened. And it so happened that shortly before it, Jacob's expensive, private, and medical insurance expired. And he didn't have time to get new ones. So together with a private clinic, in which the room is similar to a luxury hotel room, was a man in the most ordinary hospital, lying on a bed in the company of other poor people, among them a pensioner, a homeless man, and a construction worker who had taken over the attack. We're on overtime, no weekends. Lying there, coming to his senses, Jacob suddenly realized that perhaps he had been too optimistic, because his wife had only looked in once, crying, asking what to do, never raised his hands on her. But here, I wanted to shake her so badly that her brains would fall into place, because what do other wives do? Jacob himself has seen, carry their husbands' home-cooked meals, get medicine, and he's alone. His son didn't even visit. Adriana told him that the boy was depressed, and Jacob covered his eyes. But himself didn't move. Memories came instead. It was like someone had gotten inside his head, dug up the box, cursed it, dusted it off carefully, and took out the thing his soul raved about the most. Though it seemed, well, how many years had passed, what did it even have to do with the present? And then came these memories, and that was it. Jacob was very green then, yesterday's students. But it was the dashing 90s, and he, like many of his peers, was like infected with a fever. What pushed, chased, lit faster, brighter, take everything you can. But there were already sprouts of the real thing. Like the affair with Adriana. A good girl from a decent family. Parents who had connections that could be very useful for a young businessman. And just when it was all out of place, came Anna's love to her at first sight into one who was nothing at all. The girl this thin folded like a heron. Her name was Betty, and Jacob ran into her in a restaurant, and literally ran into her. Either he pushed her accidentally, or she just picked him up with expensive drinks. As yelled the manager who came over found himself on the floor. Jacob greatly said he would pay for everything. Did the girl drop her eyes on him? No, not the eyes yet. He looked into them and disappeared. He realized he could sing Moldavian lakes about those eyes. Everything was so fast, and the meeting of his promises, her hands timid. But he woke up when Betty told him she was pregnant. He realized how screwed up he was. We were already married to Adriana, and Dad trusted Jacob like a son. How could you give up the right path? I mean, for eyes like those that you can't find anywhere else in the world. I had to give her a stern talking to. Jacob handed the girl a wad of cash and told her there was nothing more between them. She should abort, and it would be best for everyone. He remembered well how thin, snotty fingers had caught him by the hem of his jacket, how she begged him not to leave, said she had nowhere else to go, and that her family had shamed her like that and wouldn't take her back. He said, "That's enough," dumped her, picked her out of his own heart without pity. And now, it's too late. It was stupid. And he thought about the fact that if this child had been born, he would be about the same age as Charles. And with that memory, he found out. And the next day, after morning rounds, his wife entered his room unexpectedly. She sat down on the edge of the bed and put an envelope next to her husband. She lowered her eyes and pressed her lips together. "What is it?" Jacob, barely listening to the Messiah, with his finger and opened the envelope. Inside, he discovered money. He looked at it confusedly, where his wife could only have gotten it from, and why she had brought it to him here. And then she spoke, and Jacob at first thought his heart would stop. But it didn't, and he had to listen and be horrified. It turned out that under a general power of attorney, Adriana sold their apartment and also withdrew all the money, that there were still crumbs left on his account. So she sold the car and even a collection of antique hunting horns from the 18th and 19th century. Jacob, I can't take it anymore. Got hit by a woman, but didn't hurt a tear, didn't ruin the makeup. Jacob wondered if he'd ever seen a wife cry at all. And I can't stay a penniless bum, and all because of you. I sold everything, and you have no right to demand it back. Because as my husband, you have to do your duty. And you stopped taking care of me. And Charles, you betrayed our family. Here we are. So she slapped her palm with scarlet sharp nails on the envelope. This is where I left you, son. You inherited this apartment from your parents, didn't you? Yes? Yes, but I haven't lived there for a long time. I don't remember. My brother, I think my third cousin or whatever lives there. So you have a place to go. Adriana smiled as if all problems were solved. And me, I'm sorry. I'm going to my parents to live. And if you respect me, please don't show up there. I'm filing for divorce. I'm sorry, but I can't take it. And then you're a debtor. They'll be looking for you. You could ruin my life. What he means to say is that he's paid off most of his debts, but he realized there was something important. What about the son? So he doesn't need a father. Charles is all of a piece. No, he's too good a boy. He's a fool, and he said he's going to live with Daddy. He went with your kin to make arrangements. What kind of stuff does he carry? And Charles dared to yell at me, accused me of being a thief. That's all right, I went on, and suddenly smiled wickedly. We'll realize that Mom was right, when bread is not your cheap prostitute life. For Charles, the decision he himself made came as a complete surprise. At first, when it became clear that his father was in trouble, he was angry. He had always wished that his father wasn't just made of different dough than most ordinary people. Charles had no doubt that his father was tough, and he was successful, strong, invincible. But life was hell pouring in and revealing lies and illusions. And when it became clear that his mother, whom Charles, on the contrary, had always considered a woman, who without a protector for life is not adapted to life, when she did to his father so cool, then Charles felt his own vulnerability. No, he didn't have a guilty conscience about anything and everything. It's just that he realized that in his almost 30, in fact, jumping life is not clear what to do with it now. But at least his father understood him. They were friends, and his mother was a lecturer, always criticizing over little things. Charles didn't want to live with her. That's how yesterday's golden boy ended up in a crack house on the outskirts of town. Lucky still that the apartment had 2 rooms and a distant relative by the name of Noel. The man is some kind of strange. The whole house, to veil the shores, said that the native is sacred and will not interfere in any way. But not to touch the question either. And I did not think squeamishly, assured Charles. Carried a bag of my father's things into the room. Thought it wouldn't hurt to put a lock on the door. A few days later, he picked Jacob up from the hospital, and they tried to just get on with their lives. And it was not easy. Charles was angry again, now at the circumstances and at himself. It was a strange feeling. He could barely cook dumplings, and washing in the machine was an unimaginable ordeal. Yes, I allowed gaps in your upbringing. Jacob shook his head. When my son came home from the store gave him expired milk and yesterday's bread. It's all right. We'll get through this. Under the windows in the yard covered with fall leaves and already marked by local dogs was a Ferrari. Charles out of place in the local landscape and to Jacob's eyes, prohibitively expensive for their current situation. We should sell it, he said. To his son at dinner, it'll be a start. I think we'll try the fertilizer trade. I have an old acquaintance who can help with reliable suppliers and, most importantly, with the market. Well, I'll take care of all that, of course. You'd better get a regular job for now, son. Where will I go?" Charles sighed and tossed the dumplings in the bowl incredulously. He wanted marbled beef steak for dinner. That's what they're all about. Well, for a lower position. Sorry, we're in the same one your parents overestimated you to be in. You didn't do anything. So don't embarrass yourself and don't make any money anywhere. Dismissed. Go at least as a sales manager at a cell phone store for starters. Charles almost choked and looked glumly at his father. You can't get a card yet. We have a reunion on Sunday. Will be 10 years after all. Do you want to make a big deal out of it? No. Why not? I'll walk in and say, my dad's business is failing. My mom sold her apartment and we're living with some crazy guy. That's what I'm like. Jacob just shrugged his shoulders. All right, take it, but then you'll have to find a buyer yourself. The reunion was not the first time. After all, there had been one 5 years ago, but Charles hadn't wanted to go then. He thought it was a stupid idea. He'd lost touch with his former acquaintances, except for Mason, a few years ago. But then the guy had been in a motorcycle accident and apparently having hit his head hard, had decided to change his lifestyle and move to the countryside. With the film, they sometimes crossed paths, but she then left to build a career as a journalist in the capital, and their connection was cut off. On the appointed day, Charles stood in front of the mirror of an old closet and analyzed his person. Could he be a loser just by looking at it? Or was he so okay? He wasn't going to lie much about himself, but he didn't want to tell the truth either. Humiliating embarrassment. That's what it could be. Charles decided it would be more interesting to hear about former acquaintances, to see how their lives had turned out. The meeting was set in an inexpensive, but with a good reputation. By 4:00 p.m., people were starting to gather, and all entered. Charles counted 5 people. Not dense, but here he was surprised to see Mason, not recognizing him as a bearded man in a funny sweater with reindeer on it. There was a Rick in the class, a guy who was unremarkable and a C student. And now, as it was revealed in a conversation working in a publishing house as an assistant senior editor, Kathy and Liam, the red-headed, carrot-headed twins who were involved in music as DJs, producers, and radio hosts, were also here. Christina, who was teased in class because she was a stutterer and respected because her mom was the school doctor, became a kindergarten teacher. And they all gathered around a large table with several coffee kettles, pitchers of lemonade on platters, cookies, a mini sandwich, and our Noah. They reminisced about the old days. They bragged about their successes. Charles managed to maneuver and tell himself some of the truth, leaving out a tidy bit of the current misfortune. Oh, look, suddenly for the first time Christina interrupted the conversation and poked her finger in the window. And who is that? From the window behind the graduates of the hall, well viewed the parking lot in front of the cafe. And now a strange cortege stopped there. 3 black foreign cars with tinted windows, on each of which were fixed some flags. So it looks like everyone's here, Mason said. So he was pushed back by Rick again, just like 10 years ago. Most curious. Oh my. It's from the shadow of the heat, people. Who's there? We're here. Well, the cars, the flags, the manager. This state is small, insular, and terribly closed until recently from the outside world. They just recently started sending their representatives of the business elite, diplomats, scientists around the world, establishing ties, so to speak, getting rich. They've recently found something there, and they're concerned. Oh, wait, they're coming this way, said the last appendix with such a gasp Rick, as if he had a personal UFO coming in for a landing. Well, no, you can imagine. We can't get through to them. We catch them in all countries to collect material for books, and they're wandering around our city like they're at home. I'm sorry, I jumped up and got out of the table. Somebody's legs were crushing me. And then the door to the hall opened. On the threshold stood a tall young man with blonde hair and such piercingly blue bright eyes that they seemed not real. He was dressed in a 3-piece suit, which, as our eye could tell, Charles was clearly tailor-made. On the shoulders of the named guest of the class reunion, a smoke and gray cape was carelessly but tastefully thrown on, or rather a strange cape, reminiscent of those cloaks worn by 19th century cavaliers. Just the data. The detail of the closet was shortened and profusely decorated with silver and embroidery. The mysterious guest, with a melancholy look, looked around the assembly, and then raised his hand, snapped his fingers, and someone spoke in a foreign language, and those who were behind him. Some gloomy types of closets, the kind of obviously security guards, stepped back with a slight bow. The doors closed, and the guest stepped forward. "Here we go," he said quietly. "Wait a minute. What?" James was the first to come to his senses. Rick smiled and nodded. "James, are you?" Mason opened his mouth and stood up as well. "What's so different?" He grinned at the man who, to Charles' impression, could not possibly be a past person. The persecuted, bespectacled, nerdy, unhappy man. And at the same time, it was definitely him. Then everyone started talking, greeting. Then there were handshakes, and Rick, being the most daring, even went for a hug. And he succeeded. "Yes, there's a few of us here," James said, walking to the table and sitting down on the empty seats. "It's good that the most important people are here." He joked, and everyone smiled at the look in his eyes as he said the last words, suddenly lingering on Charles. "It's weird. It's not good lingering. Hey, how are you?" Christina's always been awfully straightforward. "Wait a minute. What? Are you working for a diplomat?" Not exactly. This is more of a private visit," replied James. No, raised a finger at Rick. "Spit out who and what you are now bursting with all that is either right or the last idiot on earth is you. You're wearing their national cape. What does that even mean?" James took a breath of air, sort of leaned in modestly, and explained thickly. It turned out that he was just passing through town, or more accurately, passing through. It turned out that over the years he had somehow managed to move, and not just anywhere. And as Rick had time to explain to the audience in one of the most closed to the outside world island states, you something agonized, and then work got citizenship. The red-headed Kathy demanded an explanation. "Well, you could say that, but it's a long story, and we're in no hurry," insisted Rick, and so vigorously put the cup with tea on the table that, spilling the contents, James told those sparingly enough that he moved to these distant and located territorially almost on the equator of the islands. Indeed, at first for work, and then he got his citizenship and stayed here. "You're not lying." "Well, things happen in the world," James shrugged. "Yeah, that's the way it is. I didn't tell you. You can't get citizenship at all." I'm rounding my eyes. "Rick, only for special service to his." Rick gave James a very strange look for some reason. "A ruler or a family connection. Foreigners can work there. But then again, if it's a rare education, ability is valuable. Tourism is underdeveloped because most of the islands are nature reserves, again owned by the head of the country. But to them Portuguese, managers such that many to envy. And the fact is," finished the verbal excursion Rick, "that there relatively recently were discovered deposits of unique minerals, for which the authorities decided to export. There is such a struggle going on in the world right now. Amazing awareness." James grinned and reached to pour himself some tea. "So we are, by the way, in the publishing house where I work, we are publishing a new atlas on the islands. So we're preparing a chapter, looking for any of your people and trying to get some first-hand materials. By the way, I tried to get through to your ambassador at the book exhibition in Madrid. And nothing." Of course, Rick's obviously boiling with excitement, because just go ahead. There must be a good reason. And we're small people. I'm sorry, and you're going about your business like a comet, and you can't be caught. But now, I've caught you. Well, spill it. Can I get an exclusive interview, a local's commentary, so to speak, in the scrapbook? Well, for an old friend. Were you one of the rare ones who was with me? James said quietly and tapped his fingers lightly on the stairs. I can do a lot of things, but that was the one that changed the atmosphere because everyone here had something to remember. Liam and Kathy always ignored the way the odd, excellent student was bullied. Christina tried to stand up for herself once, but she was getting bullied, and she changed her mind about playing the hero. Mason and Charles. They were the main instigators of all the bullying. And now it was really uncomfortable. Okay, I think it's time to apologize. Mason came up. He spoke from the heart. That accident changed him a lot. He's reassessed a lot of things about the world. I'm not afraid to admit that you were a real asshole. He looked James straight in the eye. Gallipa was a young bad girl. But I apologize for everything because my soul demands it. Yeah, I forgave you a long time ago. You didn't even always act of your own free will, James said. It was a hint, and it was clear to everyone. Christina moved away from Charles for some reason and looked as if he were red-faced or dirty. I thought we weren't here to settle old squabbles, Charles said. In fact, when Mason had first started his speech, he'd felt a pang of awkwardness. But now that James clearly remembered a lot of things, and unkindly so, Charles suddenly decided to defend the ancient positions. Well, in school there are all sorts of children, naturally, to divide into groups, to be friends and enemies. Come on, what's the matter? Everybody's gone soft. They all grew up in the United Nations and became people. So what's there to be sad about now? Charles tried to ignore the fact that they were looking at him as if they wanted to say, "Shut up, please." Look, he hurriedly diluted the tension in the air by hanging his belly. What are you doing here from so far away? Did you fly all the way out here to meet us? Just a little off the beaten path. I was assigned a delicate matter. The blonde grinned. What about secrets? By the way, can you clearly say who you work for? Again, impudently cut into the conversation Clara. Well, it's really hard to explain. But simply put, I'm on the High Council. Rick, who decided to go for the throat washing, choked and coughed. Wow, so that's how it works. You're like the Prime Minister and the head of the secret police at the same time. Now I'm gonna need your comments, man. We then translate the book into every language in the world, and millions of copies. Later, all except Charles, who left the meeting gloomier than a cloud, agreed that the conversation went on in a completely different direction. And it was thanks to Rick that they talked about everything. Everyone told about himself. Questions were asked, jokes were made. And at the end of the small meeting, when finally managed to forget, refreshed the common and best memories of the past school era, like it is possible to collect the remnants of jam from the jar. Even if it seems that there is almost nothing left, Christina suddenly noticed a ring on James's hand. So you're married. It's like we're blind. Who is she, our girl or our local hottie? Her name is Cindy, and she's great. We got married this spring. And since you're my classmates, he took out his smartphone and started typing something on it. The LCD screen lit up all the way down the cafeteria hall. On it, at meetings that filmed this hall, at weddings and birthdays, often launched video home showed photos, and this case was the same. Images of a young couple appeared on the screen. Informally, apparently someone from the entourage was taking photos. But there were also selfies, and while classmates hooed and awed, considering the swarthy, handsome Islander who with her husband played golf, then they were on the beach, then he obviously caught her billet laughing, holding in one hand a frying pan with scrambled eggs, and the second hand swung at the film towel. All the while, a dark wave of envy was rising in Charles, because it was impossible. How so? Unmirrored, the dregs of society. Who was the poorest in school? Suddenly so high up on the islands in the tropics, you see. He's got a career that's too big to contemplate. And he's married to a hottie. Charles felt as if he was now fully aware of the injustice of the world. That's him. He's supposed to be successful. He's supposed to be loaded with money. And he's forced to look for a regular job. He lives with his father, a smart relative. And he's not doing well with women. All his girlfriends left as soon as his money got tight. I called one of them the other day to borrow some money, but she laughed and threw the phone down. And finally, the meeting was over. Everyone went away, promising that the next communication will take place any sooner than in 10 years. We exchanged contacts, and even James shared his. He turned around to go to his car, but Charles called out to him. "I already realized you never liked me anymore," said by looking you straight in the eye. "And I don't care how big a bird he is in his islands." Charles felt taller, realizing that he was once cooler than this upstart. And now it's not all lost. He'll rise too. But in vain now, James smiled in vain. His whole look and posture expressed absolute self-confidence, relaxed. And he pulls on the hand obviously expensive leather gloves. Everyone was genuinely sharing what was on their hearts and minds. "You thought I'd apologize for the past. Not gonna happen. That you've flown high. But know this, it happens that everyone gets lost quickly. And then you say dictatorship and savagery. You're still having the time of your life. You know, I thought you'd changed a little bit." James sighed. "Don't you get enough of what I was prepared to forget when I went to the meeting? Yeah, I was ready to forget everything you did. To let go, to forget, and part on neutrality. How is that possible?" "No." I put my palm out in a ready speech in a commanding gesture. "I'm not interested in what you have to say next, but you're the one who completely screwed it up." He said it and left it. Charles watched the motorcade drive away, and he felt like yelling for the upstart to answer, that he had ruined and lived like this. It couldn't get any worse. As the motorcade raced through the city toward a small hotel that had been rented out entirely for a few days for privacy, James closed his eyes and sank into his own memories. Back then, the night before graduation was harder than ever for him. His mother was drinking more and more. She had lost touch with reality altogether. "Grandpa, I'm afraid," one day the grandson honestly confessed. "When sitting in the old man's room, with his support to prepare for exams, you forget about fear. We decide how to eradicate this fear. What if I will be like my mother, will get drunk one day and go crazy. But you don't drink and you don't feel like it. So what for? There are cases in a person's life that make the mind break. But if you always keep your mind strong, if a man has a core inside, no trials, no sorrows, and your mind will not break. It's over, old man." He knew, understood perfectly well that grandfather himself had problems. He could hover over a formula all day long, muttering something to himself. But even so, to James, he was the best intelligent man around. And besides, there were many times when Grandpa's mind was as clear as it was now. "Your mother was a good girl. You know, I think it's time you learned." And he's on. About your mother being betrayed by a rejected man, and without personal happiness was faced with a cruel choice. She chose to keep her child, returning home, and grandmother James Betty. Years of being berated for it. Forbade her to get a higher education because the child was born, and now she supposedly had no right to it. Betty worked at one place and another. She was fired for absenteeism and later for drinking. When James was 8 years old, he lost his grandmother. She passed away from a terminal illness. James' grandfather and Betty's father had tried to protect her, by the way, but for some inexplicable reason, Betty considered, only took her mother's opinion to heart. "I hate him." A young man's feelings for his father have fallen out. "Don't you dare." His grandfather told him sternly, "You should judge a person by their actions. Tell me, what did your father do that you hate him?" He chased Mom away, blurted out to the young man all his feelings for his father. "Don't you dare." He also told her to get rid of the baby. But a lot of couples break up, and it's not always pretty. I, for example, divorced my first wife. Not only did your father do it, but in this world, unfortunately, have become easy to treat that child. If not needed, you, not born, like a bug. Flush. Can you swear with your heart's blood that your father was not sorry for what he did? Do you think he didn't show up with a wedding ring for Mom and a teddy bear for you? Maybe he doesn't know you were born. Your mother went to the village to our distant relatives, then moved to the city so you could go to school here. I have to talk to her, find out about my father." James jumped up. "But you know the state she's in. I don't care. If Daddy's good, he'll help her heal. But not this time, not next time. I'd like to know the truth about Mom." She, barely realizing what it was about, started crying, reached for the bottle, and ended up launching it at her son's head. James was angry with her and said that he would find his father one day and pull him out of the ground. And then there were the final exams from school. The house was resettled. We moved into a new apartment, but almost immediately Grandpa came down with pneumonia. He joked, barely breathing, that houses and walls help, that he was like a tree, ripped out with roots and transplanted. It seems, and the soil is fat. Everything is there. Will not take root in a new place if ripped out naturally. Grandpa died then. And then the guy did not know how to even exist further. He remembered that he promised his grandfather that his life would turn out well, as only possible well. Grades allowed to enter the budget, and almost anywhere. So James decided to become an archaeologist. He went to another city, studied, and was ready to work in his specialty. But by chance an advertisement came to his eyes about the need for employees on cruise ships. All new acquaintances, having heard about such an idea, twisted their fingers at the temple, say, to work on the seas for pennies, to sail as a maid, instead of having a normal career. But James decided, and that's it. He was only going to work like this for 6 months, a year at the most. But one day, a cruise ship docked at one of the islands that made up the state called Figure. He went ashore and looked in the local museum. He was blown away by the restrained generals. Their uniqueness was seen by the guy as a miracle of nature, and he realized that he was ready to give everything for the fact that here and nowhere else on Earth he would not work. With his peculiar assertiveness, he literally in 2 days, while the liner was off the coast, learned everything. It turned out that the development of the fields had just begun, and there was quite a shortage of specialists of the necessary profile with good education. But at first, they did not want to let him directly to the bosses who solved all the issues. They said that the competition was announced, applications submitted, and workers will be selected. Specialists from all over the world are ready to fight for vacancies. You're a young man, about 3 or 4 years old. Wait and see. There might be something for you. But James then just sat on the porch of the Ministry of Geology, which occupied literally one house and half with the Ministry of Environment, and said that he would not go anywhere until he was considered on an equal footing with everyone else. Some of the locals laughed at the naive foreigner. Some frowned and threatened to call the police because, sorry, it's an outrage to behave like that. But before the last girl, Chernobyl came up to him, a bold beauty with huge golden rings and elegant glasses, and in a silk sundress with mottled parrots scattered on the green background. She asked him what was wrong. He answered honestly. Then she laughed and held out her hand, rising. "We need Ukrainians like that." The beauty led from James straight to the office of the minister, sat down, and said that this guy is fresh blood, which will help Alex to enter the international market with its generals, and stepped aside, brewed coffee for an in-depth conversation. Turns out she was the daughter of the local and the Minister of Geology. She was only 18. She was an art student at the local college and a volunteer with the Seacoast Conservation Club. She volunteered at an orphanage, studied at the School of Dance. In short, this girl was a hurricane. Bright not only in appearance, but also in disposition. Cheerful, upbeat. On the fast track, James obtained a work visa and quickly began to build a career. Thanks to the internet, he was able to continue his education remotely, consult with leading experts in his field from many corners of the world. And then one day there was an earthquake. It was not great, almost without destruction, but in the mountains, the largest island in Jersey was being mined for minerals. And there was a cliff. James and Cindy were there at that moment. They were trapped. The rescuers took 4 days to reach them and had no hope of finding them alive. And when they did, the whole little party was jubilant. The girl was alive, but James was on the edge because all those days he had been giving her their existing supplies of water and food and clean air from an emergency oxygen tank. That's how I realized what this man was like, and sympathy grew into true love. The ruler of the country, its permanent leader for more than 40 years, personally recognized the merits of the guy who became a hero and decided that such a man was worthy of much. He granted him citizenship, a place among his closest advisors, and blessed his marriage to his niece. And it turned out to be a complicated family. Her grandmother was a local priestess, and her mother was the wife of the Minister of Commerce. It seemed that everything in life had worked out in such a way that one could not wish for more. But there was something that kept James from enjoying the gifts of fate. It was the past, a beloved wife and people who had already become family. In fact, giving James and the greatest jewel he'd been deprived of since his grandfather's death, a family, and a family large and close-knit. They, of course, noticed something was wrong with him. And then one day they told him to go to his grandmother Laredo, using the only way she knew how to censure him. Told him that the future was where a long, happy life awaited him, closed off from James by what she called the blacks and parasites of the past. Those were, as grandmother clarified, thoughts, emotions, regrets, doubts, and resentments. She said he had to let it all go. But what should I do? He asked in confusion. And the old woman said that he had to decide for himself. Then James decided to consult his wife. She said that perhaps he should go to his homeland, see the people he used to know. Maybe he should try to find his father. James seriously thought about it and realized that this is exactly what he would do to close the past forever and enter a new life. The man contacted one of the best detective agencies, and they accomplished the impossible. They tracked down a man who years ago had almost 100% had a fatal affair with James' mother. And when his name was called, James was shocked, because anyone but no. Could this man really be his father? Jacob. When his son returned from the reunion, he tried to ask him about everything. The usual sibling curiosity. The son told us sternly that it was none of his business, and went straight to bed. He was gloomy for the next few days. All that his father got out of him was another complaint about his share, that everyone had settled down like people, and he was the only one who had fallen down. Jacob, I wanted to say that you can't say that. It's still good. Maybe even now there is a place to live, something to buy food with. But he just waved his hand. And a few days later, Jacob underwent an examination, and the doctor delicately, but still said, "You need expensive treatment." Jacob foresaw that the conversation with his son on this topic will not be easy, but he certainly didn't expect such a reaction. "You thought I'd sell my car because of your ailments." Hess curved his lips as they sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea. "No, Dad, there's free medicine and you can get treatment, son, but I can't wait. Because if we spend all the money on diseases, we'll go to the world. Have you forgotten? You said it yourself. We have to start a business. I can't start it, son. I can barely walk to the store like an old man." "Well then, I'll run the business," he said. "I'll run the business." "Oh, son, when did you ever run a business? Tell me. I paid your salary and didn't ask you anything." "Turns out you shouldn't have. I think if you have everything, you'll grow up smart and grateful. Now I realize I was wrong. I see what's going on with this millionaire." His son went to a pizzeria and worked part-time at his father's expensive company. But he started at the bottom. School of life. Apparently, too much at once is like having a sweet tooth, and it's bad for you. Are you talking nonsense? "No, if you sell the car, I'll put the money in your account. I'm sorry." And I guess he added it on purpose, knowing it would hurt your father's feelings, not just your mother's decision to divorce you. "I guess I gave him a reason to." "You shouldn't do that to your father," said Noah, who, it turns out, heard the whole conversation in the hallway. "I see you, Charles, Fashionable vengeance hangs over you with a punishing sword. Shall you decide for yourself? And made passes with the hands of the country. And another clever Charles pushed Noah out of the way, began to dabble and dress. Decided to go out ahead, air it out, and have a glass of stout to calm the nerves. Lately it only helped to reconcile with reality. My hands were shaking after the libations, and his head ached, but Charles couldn't stop, and he didn't want to. One of the next days, when Noah was not at home, he went at dawn to the local market, a small, impromptu market in an old square, to buy some old books to read. Charles left to meet a man who had called on the ad to buy a car. Jacob, on the other hand, was home alone, and suddenly the doorbell rang. He went to open it, thinking that one of the two had come home early. But on the doorstep stood a stranger, short, blonde, and expensive-looking. It was Jacob Poor, with a businessman perfectly learned to read in clothes. Behind the man's back stood more people, and he too realized they were security. "Hello, you, Jacob." He didn't ask, he said yes. "My name is James Sokoloff. Do I have something to talk to you about?" "No, I'm not in debt. I have nothing to do with your creditors, but I need to talk to you about something from your past." "Hello. Okay, come on in." Jacob waved his hand invitingly. I was a little surprised when the man in English ordered the people who came with him to wait downstairs. The mysterious guest didn't enter empty-handed. He brought a box of coffee cakes, and Jacob noted that it was not something off the shelf of a convenience store, but from an expensive pastry store. He himself sometimes bought some for tea. When? A long time ago, as if it were a past life, when he wanted to treat his family, gather them all around the table. He also remembered that neither his wife nor his wife liked it. They always had something to do. In general, on this day Jacob, himself especially unwell, felt the medicine, which the doctor told to take daily in the morning the day before, ran out. He cut up the stash. It was empty, of course. It was Charles. It was necessary, accordingly, to go to the bank and withdraw from the account for the medicine. But it would still take a while to get there. They came into the kitchen. Jacob made tea. "So you wanted to talk about my past, but what exactly?" James had prepared a speech, very clear, easy, diplomatic. But now that the man who was most likely his father was sitting across from him, all these words were forgotten, and he just a little bit emotionally confused, as it were. That there lived a girl named Kelly. She got involved with a man out of her league, and then Jacob barely had time to take a bite of cake and tea. Naturally, from such a story were left aside. His eyes went wide. How? How is this even possible? So heavy and on the heart warmed, and literally so. The heat was spreading through his chest. "So you're my son. It all fits, but we'll need a genetic test to be sure. At my expense, of course. And if you don't mind, of course I don't mind." "No, I don't mind. I think you have my nose." Suddenly, he reached out and touched his son's face, and immediately jerked as if he'd been burned. "Oh, I'm sorry." "No, it's okay." James took Jacob's hand. "Maybe it's you, Dad. It's been all these years. I was 7 years old. My son and my own son was there for me under those circumstances, and I shook my head. You have a brother, Charles, but he's not home. He's about your age now." "I know, we were in the same grade." Jacob shook his head again. How fate played tricks on people. But he hadn't said anything about what Charles had done to James at school, and he decided not to hurt his father. Decided he wouldn't say a word about that part of his past for anything. And then he noticed Jacob suddenly pale, wrinkled, and slouching in his chair. What happened? Jumped up, didn't have to go to Anapa. "Yes, all right." Said the man had a heart attack. No first aid kit, if only water. A glass of water was served immediately. "No, doctor, don't need one." "Sorry, son." He called it that, even though the examination was still a few days away. But it seemed that my heart was telling me, swearing that all this was true. "I can't do nothing when you're in such a state of stubbornness, can I, James?" Yes, I guess I'd better soon, Jacob wheezed. The doctors arrived amazingly quickly and said immediately that without hospitalization, alas, cannot do without. Are you a relative? The doctor asked. He's my father. Then help your father pack. I'm afraid he's going to be here for a long time. Oh, you've neglected your father. The doctor shook his head reproachfully. It's not his fault. He just arrived today. Jacob interceded with his last strength. He didn't know I was sick. He just didn't know. The other thing the doctor had realized was that the son of the man who lived in the apartment was in need of renovation. This young son is clearly not poor, and from the video, James aside talked about the fact that, judging by Jacob's medical history, the issue of medication needs to be addressed urgently. It will be done in an hour, she nodded. James dials the phone of his assistant, waited, and together with the guards will contribute. Already when everyone was going downstairs to go to the hospital, ran into on returning home Noah, whom Jacob asked to tell Charles that he is sorry, but put on treatment. Who's that? Asked Noah, eyeing James suspiciously. My son, answered Jacob decisively, and slowly walked further down. The elevator didn't work. Charles returned from the meeting in a rage at his then found a lot of flaws and mercilessly beaten. And he, naturally, did not agree to any of it. Quite at rock bottom he felt when Noah informed him that his father was in hospital. He and his son added at the same time glue a new amulet on the wall, some image of the sigh of a black bird. Are you out of your mind? I just got back. Charles shook his head. Well then, with another son, shrugged the weirdo and stuck out his tongue and continued his lessons. Your aura is bad. By the way, it needs to be cleaned up. He barked at everyone. I run down the stairs because the elevator is not fixed yet. At the hospital, I managed to find the doctor who was treating my father. But for some reason, he started talking about the same thing. Are you all crazy? What son? Here I am. Charles pounded his fist on his chest. And I'm his only son. But that's for you to sort out among yourselves. The doctor dismissed him tiredly. He had a lot to do today. You can visit your father today. And we need to decide on further treatment options soon. Yeah, surgery. Yes, I think surgery is the best option. Yeah, anger, Charles muttered. And you can pay for free, but you'll have to wait. Theoretically, under the cover of drugs, it is possible, but the best option to spend it in a private clinic. No money. With these words, Charles slammed the door to the office and went to look for his father's room. When he found it and looked in, he thought at first it was a glitch, because the hated James was sitting in the chair next to his parents. What are you still doing here? He raised his voice as soon as he walked in. Get out. Charles. The father in the bunk was like a stranger. Not the man he'd always known. He was weaker, like an old man. And it was kind of squeamish to see him like that. Charles, there's something I have to tell you. Well, you can tell me what's about to be discharged. Just get this one out. What the hell did he bring all that stuff for? Dad can't worry. James' tone was like Charles had pulled a string. Calm down. Listen to yourself while they speak kindly. But out of evil stubbornness, Charles only smirked, smoothed his lower lip. And this is my father. We'll take care of this ourselves. Son, but he's your brother, Jacob whispered. What's all the fuss about? A nurse came into the room. I'm going to kick everyone out. There are patients in here, by the way. Meanwhile, the patients were shooting at you in the hospital. Because, as you know, lying around is boring. And something interesting was about to happen. Charles could hardly believe what he was hearing. Bullshit, a gamble. He can't get it. He's lying. Genetic testing won't lie. The result will be tomorrow, James said calmly. And I'm not going anywhere. By the way, I'm taking care of my father. Don't worry. The hat smile cut into his self-esteem. Pride of Charles. When the masks are on, I'll cover all treatment costs. We won't accept anything from you. Making a final argument based on nothing more than my own opinion, naturally. We don't want anything from you. Son, why are you doing this? He's your brother. Yeah, brother. And you cheated on your mother. I'm not saying it wasn't my fault, whispered Jacob, who didn't feel good about the whole conversation. It just happened. But I realized later how wrong I was to leave anything behind. It was wrong. It was cruel. And James forgiving me and finding me is a miracle. He's my son, and he wants to help. Charles, come on. I get it. You're angry for some reason. Why? I thought you were in the same class. Charles just went as red as a tomato and burst into a violent speech about what he really thought always nerdy upstarts poor classmates, and these were not nice, cruel words. No, I won't accept help, and I'd rather have no father at all than for myself. I'll take the money. James finished his speech. James got up from the table and slowly stepped toward Charles. He only had time to read in his eyes that he had overreacted. The next moment, Charles was blown out into the hallway. But in fact, he was taken out by the kindness there delicately. So, silently, painfully grasped his shoulder, quietly said again, reinforcing the eye contact. Keep in mind, you're only safe because your father wouldn't approve. But remember, I will not allow myself to bully him. Do you understand me? Yes. You live like this, you've seen a lot, and then you see this. That was Dr. Jacob. He came in about 5 minutes ago and was standing in the hallway. He needed to talk to one of his patients and just so happened to hear everything. So you gave the doctor a stern look at Charles. You'd better leave, unless you want your father to have a heart attack from the stress. I'll help you find the door. You take it easy. This is a hospital. Turn to Layden and let's talk about what we can do to help. Jacob and the treatment will be long and difficult. At the same time, one of James' aides drove up to the hospital. The necessary medicines were bought, and from that very day, Jacob received all the necessary treatment. And as it happened, he recovered sharply. The need for surgery was still looming on the horizon, but it could be postponed. The next day, the lab results came back. The familial connection was confirmed. Charles left the hospital, came home, and started drinking. He just didn't understand what was happening to his life or what to do about it. You know, ideally, your father should take a vacation somewhere on the seaside, cautiously advised the doctor. Speaking once again, James, it was already clear that he was a wealthy man. And so Jack, as the doctor was called, could safely recommend the best for his patient. Just, not a couple of weeks, but a couple of months at least. After a little thought, James answered. He would have a medical escort on the flight. Goody. The doctor grinned. Ah, Jacob had been lucky. And at first it seemed that with a son like Charles and a wife who brought the news of the divorce directly to the hospital. I mean, it was really bad. And you'll give us all the recommendations. I will. Jack nodded and added, be careful. I don't want to pry, but if I get the chance. In general, try to provide father favorable emotional background, the state of the nervous system. It means a lot in his case. Jacob, it is news that he was shown a vacation by the sea, and he may have taken joyfully and shocked at the same time. While he was in business, he hardly ever allowed himself a vacation. What vacations and seas? All in labor for the capitals, for the family. He agreed, but he also tried to talk about Charles. You're brothers, aren't you? Yes, we were in the past. But maybe we can reconcile. I'd like that myself. In my family, they say it's as dangerous to keep an evil memory close to your heart as a snake around your neck. I'll try. I'll talk to Charles and tell him we can have another chance. As in kindred spirits, now that things have changed, he sighs, and if he agrees, let him fly with us. Maybe the change of place will help him change. If everything works out, I'll help him with his job too. Same place. At first, Charles didn't want to talk to his brother about anything. To him, the appearance of James in this capacity seemed to him the most cruel mockery of fate imaginable. But his stubbornness was slowly failing, especially since the house had run out of alcohol. The fact was that another insufferable relative of Noah had simply poured it all down the sink while Charles slept, and then left the apartment and locked the door, so it couldn't be opened from the inside. Then he called Charles awake, and through the door shouted to him that he was doing everything for his good, that there was a stock of food at home. Light, water was also available. So please sit and think, asked Noah, who collected a little bit of Jidkov, and for a couple of days moved to an acquaintance. It will be better for you. Charles roared from the other side of the door, kicking her, threatening her with all sorts of things. But what could he do? He just sat there. That's how Noah got off the booze. I was horrified to see what my father was doing in the hospital, and I felt bad for him. James, brother, it turns out. The anger was less, but the irritation remained. And then the brother called and said they needed to talk, and told him that his father and their father were doing much better. Charles listened and suddenly found a grain of truth in what he had said. After all, he himself had said at the meeting that the feuds of youth were nonsense, teenage nonsense. And now, when a helping hand was offered, when it was possible to live again, Charles realized that he would not forgive himself if he missed such a chance. After all, he was under no obligation to make up for James with brotherly love, but simply to be kin, for making his father well, for helping him with money and business work. And why not? Alstein met people from other latitudes of the planet unusual and sultry, even for his weather climate. It seemed that the sun brooded and spilled into oceans onto the earth. Finding peace and thought could only be found indoors under the cover of air conditioners. James put the relatives in a small villa overlooking the ocean and naturally provided everything, so that they could feel no worse than tourists coming to these islands for a vacation. Jacob quickly recovered. It was the climate, because the heat began to subside after a couple of days. High-class treatment, as well as, of course, positive emotions. James would have been happy to spend more time with his family, but he could not wait for business, and he was working long hours. Numerous boisterous relatives on his wife's side took the news that he had found a father and brother. Positively, they were cordial, welcoming, and open to new family members. Jacob took a great liking to his sister-in-law. She was amazingly respectful of her husband's father, and even impressed him with some knowledge of Russian. She could say bon appetit, good evening, and a great day for the beach. In general, happiness came over Jacob suddenly, and he could not believe it. Could life really change like that? Charles. He socialized quietly with him, but shied away from keeping his brother and father company on excursions. He enjoyed all the benefits from James, was amazed that, it turns out, he was willing to give him a job. The family owned a firm that organized tourists' vacations, and there was a vacancy for a manager. Charles hinted about his business. James said that it was more complicated, but that it was something that could be worked out. Perhaps it would have to do with construction. The island was experiencing a boom in the construction of new homes. Its infrastructure was being developed. But it wasn't all smooth sailing, according to Charles. He'd seen his brother succeed, and even against the background of Charles' own recently luxurious life, it seemed too much. Why was that? As James, coming from down under, was such an honor. You see, in a couple of months, there will be a reception at their ruler, and there will be awarded for services to a small abstract state. And you can even bring your family. Charles saw how good his brother's wife was, and almost choked on his morning tea when she joked that her husband loved her alone for the time being. But according to their customs, it was possible to have a second wife. And if James wanted one, he would have to submit to her. That was over the top. Charles was torn between two shores. He was sick of his brother, and he realized that without him he'd have to live without money again. But no. And one day when Charles was bent over the island and in such a disgusting mood, some man came up to him in a shopping center, looking like a native of Europe, and said that he knew who Brother Charles was and knew that things were not smooth between them. He had a business proposition to make and said he had a quiet place to meet. Charles didn't understand what was going on, but decided to find out. He found the same man in a small cafe on the island, and they talked. It turned out that this man, who called himself John Smith, represents the interests of a large corporation, and she was interested in getting rare minerals that she only mines on these islands. John said that these minerals, even in small quantities that would fit in his pocket, cost $1 million, and they are too rare to export. The authorities have been saving it for themselves and want to create some technology. Is it related to energy production or something else? Charles didn't understand. Jones said there was no point in getting into those details. But what really matters, he made Charles a business proposition. You as a brother, 2 people in the country will not be particularly scrutinized at the border. Take a ticket to London. Our man will meet you there. And this is what we can offer you for a handful of these stones. He held out a sheet of paper on which was written an astronomical sum. Charles tensed. This offer was clearly dangerous. But what if it was that simple, really? He was told that these minerals would be handed over already at the airport. Then he would only have to go through customs with them literally in his pocket or in his hand luggage. Put it in, and that's it. What if he gets caught for it? Asked, but was already ready for anything. It's impossible, believe me. We don't need an international scandal ourselves. Our scientists are capable of making it, so that later the manager will not be able to prove that the new technologies were developed with the use of these minerals. I realize this all sounds difficult, but think about it. And by the way, there's time to think about it until tomorrow. Otherwise, we get it to someone else. You think about what you want out of life. Do you want a successful life, or are you determined to keep getting handouts from your brother? Until one day, perhaps you lose his favor. Before the next morning, Charles had barely left the meeting. Dialed my wife's number and said I'd do anything. That's perfect. So now you have to fly out the day after tomorrow. Take a ticket anywhere, but we need a connection in London. Give me the flight number. The exact time. That left the hardest part. Charles decided to talk to his father first. Told him that this life was all very well, but he'd like to go back for a while. Before settling down, he would like to meet his mother, and he would like to meet some acquaintances. Well, okay, said Jacob, who was watching a TV show in the living room. And you for a long time. Well, as it turns out, he averted his eyes, and Charles, thinking that probably will never see his father again, because he, if it is up to him to decide how he has changed, will not forgive such meanness, and the fact that he's doing a mean deed, not just solving the issues of some English corporation for a fee. Charles, I don't doubt it, but he also thought there was no other way out, or would he have to bow down to the Brotherhood for the rest of his life? Now he had to book the tickets. Luckily, there was money on the card. James regularly funded both of his relatives' accounts, and he didn't keep track of where they spent it, by the way. After Charles started packing, now it was necessary, of course, not to arouse suspicion, to talk to his brother. But Dad didn't know where he'd gone. But Layla did. The girl suddenly found herself in the house on the veranda overlooking the garden. Climbing on a stepladder, she was hanging the beam from the ceiling. What looked like an Indian dream catcher. What are you doing? Asked for love involuntarily slender legs of the beauty. Charles rejoiced, and as usual we didn't. The ending of his name stretched in pronunciation. The home defense smiled, and for a moment, Charles felt ashamed of what to do. Was going to. We believe that in this one, pointed to a thing wherein a strange Lazarus intertwined colored threads and some crystals. Spirits live there, guardians. Now they will protect this house from any evil. Punish the cruel one who plots evil against our family. Superstition. Charles shook his head and felt nauseous. How mercilessly the sun is scorching. I'll just save it. No, it's working. It'll be all right. Either in jest or in earnest, she tossed the islander after him. On his way out the door, James wasn't found right away. First, Charles had to go to the ministry, where he was supposed to stay until tonight. But they said he'd gone to a zoo or something. But it turned out that it wasn't a zoo, It was a shelter for animals in distress. Charles, wrinkling his nose at the smell of beasts, went to the enclosure, where James was sitting on a throw on the grass and feeding from a bottlesome creature resembling either a monkey or a huge mouse. "Well, hello there. Look, the poor thing got caught by the hawks. We thought it wouldn't survive. But that's good. In a couple of weeks in the wild, let him go." James smiled. Understandably strained, Charles smiled, and he found the scene sickeningly sweet. Not only is he so cool, but he's also taking care of all kinds of creatures. What the hell is this? And two of the powers that be are bursting with annoyance. Charles told James what he told his father. Brad must have seemed upset. Charles chased away the thought that James was capable of such a thing. A kindred spirit. He kept looking for signs in him, that he hated, that he was proud of helping his poor brother, that he gloated. He couldn't find any. It was all the more reason to dislike a relative. It's a pity, but you make sure you come back for the reception. I want to present myself properly. Obligingly averted his eyes and left. Finally, the things were packed and the tickets were bought. At the airport, Charles could hardly restrain a nervous shiver, but after the right person, as if by chance, bumped into him and handed him the envelope, which he tucked into the inside pocket of his jacket, calmed down. He waited for his boarding announcement, sipping coffee, and finally, he heard, took his bag, ticket, passport, and customs control. The border guard raised his hand with his fingers intricately folded, a gesture Charles already recognized well. And at first, before it had started from behind his brother, unimaginably annoying. It was even flattering, because only those who were related to the ruler himself were greeted in this way. But at once Charles restrained himself. What did these silly formalities mean when he would soon be a millionaire? He wondered if his father would be invited to leave here after all. Why? Let him remember who his real son was and make the right choice. Finally, the formalities were over. The border guards really showed no interest in Charles' luggage. He exhaled with relief. Suddenly, the border guards' eyes widened, and from behind them came shouts, harsh words, and stomping feet. Charles turned around, and immediately his hands were clasped by men in black suits. He saw his brother in uniform in front of him, and the thought flashed through his mind that he was not only in the council of the ruler, but also in the secret police, like me. Cold goosebumps ran down my back and disappeared, as if I decided we're the idiot who got himself into trouble. Into what enormous trouble? Charles met James' eyes. He was truly afraid because his brother's eyes were cold, empty, cruel, like he'd never seen him before. The people around him stared and parted, making way. Charles lashed out without trying, was ushered into a car. His brother got into another. They drove around town for a long time and finally stopped in front of an unpleasant building. Charles was taken inside and led into a very plain-looking office. He was surprised because there were no handcuffs. Should there have been or shouldn't there have been? He didn't understand anything. He was now sitting on a chair, opposite, at the desk, his brother and some other guy. "My deputy." "Sorry, it's a formality." So James knocked, put up his palms, put them back. Charles nodded, reached into his inside pocket, and dropped a pouch on the table. James took it, untied it, and dropped out a handful of small, scarlet, ruby-like stones. "What's this for?" "I was promised payment." "No." "Why did you do it?" They were silent for a few minutes, staring into each other's eyes. Then Charles spoke, laid it all out as it was, that he couldn't live like that on his brother's handouts, always knowing that he owed him everything he had, that he couldn't see him around, and realized that he couldn't achieve the same thing as a shadow. He said all this and fell silent because he suddenly felt devastated. It was so strange, frightening. It was as if he had fallen silent, because everything he had said was slowly receding into the distance. And then James spoke calmly, unhurriedly, in details and general strokes outlined the picture of what he had heard, and Charles felt as if he were falling through the ground. And at the same time, still somehow, apparently, against all the laws of the universe, remains in place. James said that he never intended to keep his relatives' lives under strict control. He said that after that very reception, he was going to give Charles some of the shares he owned himself, which would make his brother one of the major owners of a large company. He also added that his sister had lovely cousins in marriage, one of whom bore the title of princess, and they were asking about Charles. Perhaps one of them could be his consort. "You're an idiot, and I'm afraid I've just been fooled by you. You're as much of an idiot as you were in high school when James finished his speech. Now, as you realize, none of this is possible. But you're my brother." Charles Bell, a nervous shiver. "Talk to whoever you need to talk to. I'm sorry, but stealing minerals is too much. I can't just erase it. What's going to happen to me now with all your voice?" asked Charles. He suddenly thought of Figs as a small island nation. It's not like many other countries, they say. It's kind of a dictatorship. Yes, open to tourism, but breaking the rules here. The consequences can be severe. I guess he's in trouble. If this had happened 20 years ago, I'm afraid you'd be thrown into Crocodile Lake, James said, with a look on his face that made it hard to tell if he was joking badly or seriously. "But you said it right. I'm your brother, and to treat you too harshly would be to cast a shadow over me. So I think I can get you some leniency. What's going to happen to me?" Charles asked. "You'll go away and never be able to come back. Your idea of you to the third knee won't get our visa. Also, I'm afraid the Council of Elders will insist that right here," and James touched his forehead, "you've been branded a thief. What, are you out of your mind?" Charles jumped up. "You don't think that's a stealing offense, do you? That's still pretty mild." James came up after him. He said a few words in the local dialect to his assistant, and he put the stones in the safe. "The Council of Elders will be assembled. They have been called now. Let's go." No, I'll complain. And my father has a weak heart. He'll have a heart attack if they do this to me." He's got a point. You should have thought about your father's feelings when you decided to betray your family by becoming a thief. I've tried talking to the elders, but no promises. Brother didn't make me drag you. Finally, really upset, James said. Charles Ponomarev walked into the street with his brother at his head. For a second, he looked ahead. If you crossed the alley, you could see the streets. Passers-by were hurrying about their business, but Charles immediately restrained himself. But where is he going next? It's an island. Surely the airport and the ports already knew that such a person could not be released. And then he wanted to believe that perhaps things had happened in the past. But now James was doing everything for him himself, because Charles had not asked him for anything, not for any expensive things. And so Charles reasoned. Mentally, I sat in the back seat of the car. There's a chance it's all going to be okay now. In fact, James, let's not assume the worst. Yes, he'll lose everything. But Charles suddenly admitted to himself that losing it all would be his own fault. That's fine. The main thing was to get out of here as soon as possible. He also thought he'd have to confront his father with the fact. Let him decide which son he wanted. He couldn't imagine that his father, if there were any of those wild elders, decide to brand him, and he decides to stay with James. The cars with Charles in the backseat and James in the driver's seat set off. There were no accompanying cars. We need to take the ferry to a neighboring island, Charles' brother explained. The trip will take 2 hours, no more. It will soon be over. Charles grimaced at the ominous sound. The city's outskirts floated by. Then the car plunged on steam, and then the island again, a road leading off into the jungle. They drove in silence. Suddenly, the walkie-talkie in the car clicked off. James picked it up. With his other hand, he held the steering wheel, listened, and quickly spoke to someone. What happened? Also alarmed criminal passenger. We're driving along the border of the reserve. Poachers have been captured there. What the hell are they? James hit the steering wheel with feeling. They're getting agitated. Bulls. We need to be careful. Bulls. What bulls? There's a lot of big animals around here. For some reason, Charles didn't like this news very much, but his brother had no time to answer him. A cloud of dust appeared ahead. The wind picked up, and the next moment the air was filled with the sound of mighty reefs. It became clear that a herd was rushing along the road. James began to back up sharply to get to a place where he could turn around on the narrow road without risking getting bogged down in the dense tropical vegetation. And the problem was that the drive into the interior of the island was uphill, while the drive back down the slope was downhill. What was seriously making the car so difficult to drive? Half of Spain smokes. Is bulls approached, or was it buffalo? What does a buffalo even look like? Charles wondered at the same time and marveled at the nonsense. The brain gives out at the worst possible moment. He screamed when he realized that no, they wouldn't have time to turn the car around and drive back at full speed. When he realized that they're gonna come out of the fields right now and just tear it down. And then the car was in the part of the road where you could have time to turn around normally. James steeply turned the steering wheel to the right. Charles, who had forgotten to buckle up, fell back on the seat, sat down, and the car rocked again. But now without the driver's input, just in the same part of the road sloped steep, practically from the spring went further down, and the car forces, naturally their quite laws of physics dragged. Before the fall began, Charles still had time to think about the fact that at least the avalanche of things bringing past the bulls had not hit them. And then the world turned upside down, shook terribly, hit him, and he lost consciousness. When he woke up, he realized that the car was lying 6 meters down the slope. One wheel was practically off its axle. The body had been punctured by rocks in several places. The side glass had shattered. Charles moved his legs and arms. Didn't seem to break anything. He climbed out of the cabin and sat on the ground behind Margot, watching the sun fall toward dusk. How long had he been lying here? Suddenly, it hit him in the head, and he remembered his brother. He rushed to the car. James was lying chest deep on the dashboard. Charles went cold, noticed the red marks on his brother's body. James woke up, opened the door, and reached for him. I don't remember exactly how to do it. He tried to feel for a pulse. Is there? He's alive. Started looking for the phone. Need help, but was already groaning in frustration. The device was smashed. And then Charles began to smell gasoline, and it was not hard to find that it was leaking out of the car, forming a decent lay underneath it. Charles could hardly think straight, but he realized that this was dangerous. His brother had to be pulled out of the car immediately. You're heavy yourself. Like that buffalo sacked senseless James outside and dragged him aside as best he could. What do we do now? Probably should have gone to the elders, found them to call for help. Charles' own cell phone had been taken away from him back there at the airport when they'd grabbed him. He leaned over and patted his brother's cheeks again. Wake up, brother. Suddenly there was a growl behind him. Slowly, feeling his body ease the fear, Charles turned around and had already grabbed him by the throat for some reason not far from over the hill. And the whole area here was colonists. An animal came out. It looked like a big short fur, a long-legged dog, a hyena, a tropical wolf. Some creature grinned, showing sharp saber-like fangs. What are you doing, white man? Asked Charles. Questioned the beast as if it could answer. But for some reason it was the feature of the natural snow-white coloring of its eyes. Charles looked up at the trees. Run, climb up the branches, higher and stay back. They'd probably be gone soon enough. They will look for them and save them. Charles is laughing nervously. Now he wants to be rescued by those he wanted to run away from. Here's an opportunity. James had been stationary until then. Suddenly weakly stiffened and turned his head a little and opened his eyes. His brother called out. Charles shifted his gaze from him to the beasts. It appeared that he was now hiding in a tree, and this beast of white would throw itself at James. He, as his nose wrinkled, and signified a wounded man. James was bad. He couldn't not run. He couldn't defend himself. The beast took a step forward. Charles also felt tears streaming down his face. A terrible choice. But he made the decision. because he realized he could not do otherwise. The beast crouched to the ground, tensed the muscles on its withers, and saliva dripped down onto the ground to save Vasco. "I'm sorry, it's all my fault," Charles whispered, meeting James' gaze. And then the albino predator that bore the sacred beast's name leaped over the horde. Teeth out, powerful jaws clamped shut. The stick that Charles held out in front of him gestured defenselessly with a desperate cry. It was only because the wood was still damp that the splintering didn't come apart at once. Charles literally lay over his brother, covering him with the stick, thrusting it randomly forward. The predator grunted unhappily. Then the wood gave in and cracked. The jaws opened and closed again. Charles screamed again, and then, after what turned out to be endless flashes of pain, darkness closed in on him. When he came to his senses, he wanted to scream again and waved his arms. He was caught by his arms and legs and put gently back into bed, dazed and looking around. He realized that he was lying in a hospital room, hands, legs in place, but in bandages. And they hurt. The bandages were painfully revealed, and on his head rested on a pillow. Charles stared questioningly at the doctor. He explained in broken English that everything was fine. No life-threatening injuries. "Brother, what's wrong with him?" A new thought caused Charles to flounder again, and the doctor began to reassure him again. "I'm alive, brother, and thanks to you," said James, who entered the room. He didn't look so good either, but he was much better. It was only in the next few minutes that it became clear that they had been found quickly. Before the car had collapsed, James had managed to press a button, transmitting a distress signal. The attacking animal turned out to be a rare-looking hyena, an old male and hunter, the leader of the pack. "We were lucky he was out hunting alone that day for some reason." "Yeah, lucky," agreed with my brother, and Charles showed up. "He's gonna be sore for a long time. I can feel you saving me." And Charles didn't say anything back, but it was just something he couldn't say otherwise. And then James said she made him forget about the pain. And it turned out that the elders declared what happened was the intervention of higher powers. The fact was that for the last half-century hyenas had not attacked people. And besides, albino, and among them local cultures, were considered sacred beasts at all times. They were symbols of the deity of vengeance. The elders decided that attacking you was a sign that the island had caught up with you and punished you for the atrocity you had committed. But you're innocent now. What? Are you saying there will be no more branding? Now you must appear at the emperor's reception. Yes, our ruler prefers to call himself that. What if I don't want to? Charles wanted more than anything to go home, away from the tropics. He'd even taken a job as a salesman, as his father had suggested. It would have to be with delicate pressure, James repeated with a chuckle. Well, there's no other way. Consider it another payment for what you've done. You crazy hyena. It wasn't enough. Rolled his eyes, Charles. But he doesn't understand it either. But it was funny. I had to stay in the hospital for a few weeks. The doctors were not frightening, but they made it clear that after a close encounter with the wild Gina, serious treatment was required. Charles rejoiced sincerely when he was able to walk on his own again without a cane, when mobility returned to his hands, and also had to come to terms with the fact that the scars would remain forever, including on his face. Hopefully, the brute had started. But present for another bandage, James cautioned, whispered bravo. And the doctor shook his head disapprovingly. That this is a sacred beast, he is kept as a jewel. He would be the one to manifest the will of the gods and the power of the island. To him, by the way, gifts were brought for it. Fruit, bread, and innocent maidens would perform a dance in his honor. Charles wanted to say that all this was outrageous, but he didn't. He was glad he was alive. And partially healthy, of course. And on the whole, it's fixable. Time flew by, and the day came when the whole family was to attend the reception. Charles was nervous. He and his father had arrived separately from James, who had promised to wait for them there, but his brother was nowhere to be found. The only thing left to do was to walk through the luxurious halls, meeting lots of people. Charles was grateful to her, who had volunteered to accompany them. She'd explained who was who. Finally, all the guests began to flock to the largest magnificent hall, on two sides of which stood columns in the form of palm trees with gilded leaves and trunks, studded with multicolored generals and semi-precious stones. All the guests crowded in front of the elevation on which the throne stood. Charles whistled, for which Langley pushed him lightly in the side, calling for silence. The shrill trumpets of the flute sounded. Finally, from behind the curtain came a tall, gray-haired man in an austere suit that was filled with a short cloak of fur, of some animal like a leopard. His hands were in rings. On his head shone a veritable crown. The man stood in front of the throne, said something, and all the people in the hall bowed their heads respectfully. After that, they came out from behind the curtain. As she explained, the members of the High Council, among whom was James. He sent a smile to the kinsmen in the hall. The ruler spoke in the local dialect, with an interpreter translating the speech into English for those who didn't understand the local. He spoke of the greatness of the island and how important his subjects were. But then he urged everyone not to forget the culture of their ancestral heritage, and that sometimes the gods sent surprising signs. Charles became wary. The speech continued with an account of a recent incident with a boy. Charles began to feel uneasy, and suddenly the ruler pointed his hand at him and told him to come closer. He bulged his eyes and wanted to leave altogether. But the woman sang at him not to dare to disgrace himself, and all the more to attract the wrath of the emperor. He had to submit, and standing one step away from the ruler of Algiers, Charles learned that he had been marked with a special sign and that he was forgiven. And as a sign of favor, he could ask for whatever he wanted. People in the hall aved at James, at whom Charles glanced only with his head, shook his hands and waved, as if to show that he was not a helper and did not know that everything would turn out this way. It was up to you to decide. Your Majesty, you have very interesting islands. The nature is beautiful, though not safe in some places. Perhaps you'd better not take tourists there, even if they don't usually bite. James made a frightened face at Charles not paying attention. I'd like to go back to my place more than anything. You know, there's a saying that it's good to be a guest, but home is better. James, my brother, he's made his home here, and I understand that he's decided to live here. Got married. It's all working out. But I still want to go back to my place. How my father will decide, I don't know. The doctors say a warm climate is good for him. But I hope that wherever he stays, he won't forget any of his sons. I think I was conquered by a white hyena. But I must also apologize to you personally. I apologize and promise that I won't say anything bad about this case in particular. Anyway, with your permission, I would like to leave this island as soon as possible. The ruler listened to Charles in silence, then looked at his subjects and said one word, which the translator did not translate. But he smiled. Charles went downstairs. He said your wish was accepted, and the feast for all was beginning. Before I could ask, I answered. That evening, the guests were expected a lot of entertainment, a theater performance, fireworks, dancing. The next day, Charles talked to his family. His father accepted his decision and said he would stay for the time being. James promised to find Jacob an interesting job at a local business. James himself took his brother aside because the subject was a sensitive one. Just not saying no right away is fine. I know you're having trouble with your finances. I want you to accept my help. A transfer to an account. That's one thing. You can buy an apartment and a little passive income from a small block of construction company stock, but it'll still be supportive. Thank you. Charles nodded. You should have stayed. After all, the princess herself asked you. But I think she will find a worthy match. And he answered Charles. And then he went to pack. And later, as the plane gained altitude, the islands became tiny dots on the blue canvas of the ocean below. He thought about the fact that his life would not be the same now.